Thank you, Lascan Corla. Minister, yesterday's budget, like all other budgets, had winners and losers. It had good aspects, but it had severe deficiencies. We've heard from the two ministers yesterday and government leaders today give their perspective. And of course, it's our role as members of the opposition to point out the anomalies, the gaps and the downright unacceptable outcomes from yesterday's budget. Minister, I want to start with the disability sector. Like all other sectors, partly or largely reliant on social welfare, the across-the-board increase of €12, while of course it's welcome, does not even cover the cost of inflation. This is true for pensioners, for example, who are bitterly disappointed that their pension promise campaign of an increase of €30 per week, that simply fell on deaf ears. But staying with the disability sector for now, there was palpable shock yesterday that the €500 per annum cost of disability payment for last year was reduced to €400, despite the fact that the government's own report from Indicon clearly showed that depending on the severity of a disability, the extra costs above and beyond normal costs associated with having a disability range from €8,000 to €13,000 per annum. The nominal amount of €500 given last year just covered 4% of that extra cost, and this year it's back to it covered 5%, and this year it's back to 4%. Minister, that's a totally backward step. There is also real confusion around disability funding, Minister, as Minister Donoghue's budget statement spoke about 64 million and Minister Rabbitts later on announced 195 million. Now, last year the disability budget was not clear until the HSE service plan was published in March, 6 months after the budget, and this meant that people with disabilities, unlike other groups, had no real clarity about what was in the budget. And Minister, we're speaking about a huge cohort of people here, so nothing was clear for them. But what is clear at this point is that the funding is below what the government itself outlined as being needed in the disability capacity review to respond to demographic and unmet needs. Crucially also, the Disability Action Plan 2024 to 2026 to implement the capacity review was not published in advance of the budget. And also, Minister, given that the publication of the housing strategy for the disabled people implementation plan, we would have hoped, given that, we would really have hoped to see a much stronger commitment around disability in the budget, with a stronger funding commitment there. Yes, there's 8 million for housing adaptation grants, but that deals with older persons as well as people with disabilities, and again there's no clarity. And staying with disability, this morning I spoke to a number of Section 39, 56 and 10 workers, as I have done for many years. They were here this morning preparing for their indefinite strike about to commence next Tuesday. I haven't time to go through all the details. I'm sure you're well aware of the Minister, but after the crash, these workers who provide support in the health, disability sector, the children's sector and the homeless sector saw a pay differential of at least 10% arise between themselves and HSE workers. All of them do exactly the same valuable work, but in the simplest possible terms, these workers employed by the voluntary and community sector are on significantly poorer terms and conditions than their HSE counterparts. They, Minister, were the low-lying fruit picked to save our state from going under after the crash, and pay parity has never been restored. The government quite rightly gave an increase of 10% of fee rates to criminal defence barristers yesterday and solicitors because they lost out after the crash. But Section 39, 56 and 10 workers' pay restoration was not dealt with. You've offered them 5% from the WRC. They told you at the beginning of the negotiations that 5% would not be acceptable, and there's no link to any further pay increases. Minister, you've got to get back to the table, because not only do we need to keep these workers on side and working? We have to remember that those who rely on their services, those with disabilities, children, etc., will be left to suffer from next Tuesday if these workers go on strike. Ministers, small business, small retail shops, coffee shops, hairdressers and other sectors have been left deflated by this budget. Yes, there's a 250 million inflation fund, but other than some information about possible rate rebates, there is very little there to deal with escalating insurance costs, high energy costs and very significant extra labour costs. Yes, I see some relief for angel investors, that's good, but right now, Minister, what I'm worried about is the survival of many local businesses day to day. We have small retailers watching their working capital dwindle. Many are not far from the point where their very future is in doubt, and unfortunately some have passed it. If this government doesn't give proper, targeted and accessible supports to small businesses, one by one, street by street, town by town, they will close down. We'll see big headlines about some large supermarket or multinational retail company coming to create 50 jobs or 120 new jobs. But the truth is, they're simply replacing all those local jobs that are already being lost in indigenous local supporting small businesses. I have no time to go into detail on the childcare supports except to say yes, the 25% fee reduction is welcome, but not until next September. You know, what are families supposed to do? And of course the other side of that equation, on which we have radio silence from the Minister, is the fact that childcare providers are either closing their rooms or part of their services. Minister, they need at least 100 million in the ECHI services. So I'm not saying to you, talk to the childcare providers, listen to the childcare providers and sit down and sort out the problems. Otherwise, you will have fewer and fewer, and you know, childcare services are already hard enough to get. I'm almost out of time, but just to say that the excise duty increase, which is being deferred, is welcome. But Minister, it's not enough. Stop putting your hands in the pockets of motorists and local people who can no longer afford to pay these increased fuel costs.
Thank you, Deputy.